Cutting a covenant. That may sound like a strange title to you, and I'm going to explain it here to you in a minute. But we're going to start by just mentioning the something that we all are very familiar with, and that is the Sermon on the Mount. Most of us know Jesus in the Gospels, and we hear the story of the Sermon on the Mount, and we see it as such a groundbreaking bunch of teaching that Jesus put forth there in the Sermon on the Mount. And oftentimes in it we hear, it's been said of old that you should, not kill. But I say to you, you should not hate people, right? And this is the paraphrase. And on and on. Jesus talks about some of these things in the Sermon on the Mount. We think, well, this is kind of new teaching. But the fact is, this isn't really new teaching. In fact, Job 31 is considered the Sermon on the Mount of the Old Testament. It's got many of the same themes, many of the same types of ideas in it that Jesus presented there on the Sermon on the Mount. It wasn't new teaching, it's just teaching that needed to be heard maybe in a new way through Jesus' eyes. And so we're going to look at this morning from the context of the covenant. The very first words that he makes here in Job 31, he says, I made a covenant with mine eyes. I made a covenant with mine eyes. Now, I don't think we know what covenants really mean anymore. My girls sometimes, they come up and they say, well, we're going to do this or that for you, Dad, and we're going to pinky promise. Right? If you hear a pinky promise, I'm like, what's this? What does that mean? It really mean it this time because I'm using my pinky, the most least significant finger on my hand, Yeah, okay, that makes it more important, Sometimes we say, well, I'll promise to do this or that to someone. Sometimes if you go to court, you say, I take an oath, right? I'm going to put my swear on the Bible that I'm going to do this or that, right? I don't think we understand that any of those really come close to the idea of what this idea is of making a covenant. He says that Job uses this word because in the Old Testament, making a covenant really comes down to two Hebrew words. And the words are these, karat, barit, and that means simply to cut a covenant. And there was a reason for this. You can think of maybe some times where Abraham would have made a covenant, or you've seen little bits and pieces of covenants that's being made. But when somebody made a covenant with someone else, they made a solemn promise. They said, I'm really going to follow through. I'm really going to do this. I really mean it. You would simply take an animal. A lot of times it was a cow of some type. And they would actually cut the cow straight down the middle, kill it, and put both halves of the cow, lay it there on the ground. And as they would make the covenant, they would come between the two halves, and they would make the deal. This would seal the deal. And the idea behind the symbolism of this was, if I don't follow through on what I've said, then let the same thing that happened to the cow happen to me. So when they talked about a covenant, they talked about cutting a covenant. That's the idea behind it. They would, okay, we're going to really make this official. Let's go get the animal. Let's go cut the covenant. We're going to make this have some consequences. This is what I wish upon myself if I don't follow through. And so that's the idea behind this, that there was this solemn sense of I mean it to the extent that I wish my life upon it. It means that much to me. It's not just, I'm going to commit perjury, or I'm going to, go back on my word. I'm going to lose my integrity. No, this was a solid, solemn commitment that was made, not just between the other person, but made before God. And so I think it's interesting then when we realize each one of these sections that we see here in 31, that we can't even get through them all today, they all begin with this same idea. I've made a covenant, and if I don't do this, then let this happen to me. We see this happen multiple times here in Job 31. And the first thing that he makes a covenant with is his eyes. He says, I made a covenant with mine eyes. Why then should I think upon a maid? For what portion of God is there from above, and what inheritance from the Almighty from on high? Is not destruction to the wicked, and a strange punishment to the workers of iniquity? Doth not he see my ways and count all my steps? You see, what he's saying is, I've made a covenant with my eyes, and if I were to violate that, then allow that same destruction to the wicked come upon me. Allow those punishment that goes to the workers of iniquity happen to me. This is what Job is saying. And we're going to look at the different covenants that Job makes this morning, because I don't think sometimes we take seriously enough some of the commitments that God wants from our life. Sometimes we, in the Christian life, talk so much about, well, we just know, here's the law. Even though we don't live under the law, we still have this sense about us, like, right, here's what God doesn't want us to do. The Christianity we know has become a bunch of don't do this and don't do that, right? I don't smoke and I don't chew and I don't go with the girls who do. That's the kind of thing that we think of for Christianity, right? That's what we think. It's just this list of rules. We can't do, we can't do, we can't do. And there is a sense, of course, all through the Old Testament, there's a lot of don't do this and don't do that, or you're going to be punished for this or punished for that. And of course, we know that God's holiness expects us to put away sin. Putting away sin is a key part of our Christian experience. But if that is the extent of our Christian experience, we've missed out. Because you can't just put away sin without putting something in its place. You see, he doesn't just want us to put away sin. He wants us to pursue righteousness, right? He wants us to pursue his heart with our own heart. He wants us to come in alignment with who he is and what he is and the goodness that he has for us. Think about the Sermon on the Mount. When Jesus says, hey, the Bible says thou shalt not kill. Yeah, put away the sin. He says, but I'm telling you, the real problem is your heart's not right. You need to put away the hatred in your heart. That's what pursuing righteousness is all about. And this is really where Job is coming to us from in terms of, hey, I want to pursue righteousness in my life to such a great and solemn extent that I'm willing to make a covenant within me, that pursuing righteousness is all that I want. And if I don't make that as my goal, then I'm just asking God to punish me for it. This is a covenant that he's making of his own accord. And so he begins with a covenant with his eyes. He says, I made a covenant with mine eyes. Why then should I think upon a maid? You know, we have a lot of our people in our society today who've not made any covenant with their eyes. And it's not just men, it's not just, sometimes it's ladies as well. But we have here, what's the idea behind this? That there is lust for people. Pornography is rampant in our culture today. 40 million U.S. adults regularly visit internet pornography websites. 10% admit to having an addiction. That's a big number. That's a big number. You know, lust of people is something that's not even just for men. Women are just as involved. If you look at the statistics and the numbers, it's a terrible thing. Looking upon, allowing your lust to be there. But you know what? Covetousness is just the same kind of lust. It's just instead of lust of a person, it's a lust of a thing, right? It's lust of stuff that someone has. It's not a covenant to look at other people or things. You can't keep yourself from always seeing things. But the point is, he says, the rest of the verse, he says, why then should I think upon a maid? It's not just that he's not going to always look. Sometimes you can't help but seeing things. But he says, the covenant is, I'm not going to take that second look. I'm not going to allow my heart to dwell on that person or that thing that creates lust in my life. I'm not going to allow my mind to fantasize about it. I'm not going to allow infatuation to happen in my life so that when I take that first look, it makes me dwell on it the rest of the day or think about it or act upon it. He says, I made a covenant with my eyes. He cut that covenant with his own eyes, he says. He says in verse 2, he says, for what portion of God is there from above? And what inheritance of the Almighty on high? He says the reason we can't allow ourselves to lust after other people or other things in our life is because we don't understand what God has for us. He says, what portion of God is there from above? Another way you could state this is, what has God chosen for me? When we look upon a person or a thing that God has not given to us, we are saying, God, you didn't choose good enough for me. My lust, my things that I want in my heart, the things that I desire, are more important than the things that you gave me, the portion that you've chosen for me. We have to look at things or people and realize that, God didn't give me that person. God didn't give me that thing because that's not what he's chosen for me. It's not my portion. But when we lust, we've said, God, I want what you haven't given to me. You've not been good enough to me. Can any of us sit here in church and say, has God not been good enough to us? Of course we can't. But every time we break a covenant with our eyes, that's in essence what we're saying. That God, you haven't been good enough. I want what you haven't given to me. Verses 3 and 4, he says, is not destruction to the wicked and a strange punishment to the workers of iniquity? Doth not he see my ways and count all my steps? He says, I'm putting a covenant between my eyes and my heart because God sees everything. I think that the sin of lust, the sin of covetousness are things that we think we can get away with because it all happens within us sometimes, right? If we don't act upon it at least, right? It's something that happens in our heart. It happens in our mind. It happens, just in our own thoughts. But what does he say? I have to have a covenant between my eyes because God sees my heart. God knows my thoughts. God understands where my mind is at all times. And I acknowledge the fact that he is in charge of those things. So he asks for the penalty. He says, if I allow myself to violate this, he says, bring destruction, bring punishment, bring ruin to me. Don't allow myself to get away with this covenant. He cuts the covenant with his eyes. Second thing that he sees, he cuts a covenant with his mouth. A covenant with his mouth. Verses 5 to 8. He says, if I have walked with vanity, or if my foot hath hasted to deceit. The idea here with walked with vanity really should be translated, if I've told lies to people. If I have said things that are untrue. And of course, we all know that there are white lies and big black lies, right? We like to differentiate between those because we all know we stay away from the big black lies. But the little white lies, well, what does that hurt? Well, he expounds upon this here. He says, if I've walked in vanity, or if my foot hath hasted to deceit. The white lies are there for a purpose too. We use those to just twist the fact enough, right? Just to make it so that they don't think the truth, right? To mislead, to misdirect, to misguide someone, just enough so that, hey, maybe I didn't actually come out and say the wrong thing, but I made you believe it. I made you believe what wasn't true. That's what a white lie is, essentially, right? And you know what we say in our house, and probably we all need to say it in our own lives? A lie is an intent to deceive. A lie is simply an intention to make someone believe something that's not true. Sometimes you say it outright. Sometimes you kind of present all the facts around it to try to mislead and misguide someone. But the bottom line is we are there trying to deceive someone. And that's something that should never come out of our mouth. It's not something we should ever invent with our mind. And so he says in verse 6, let me be weighed in an even balance, that God may know mine integrity. You see, someone who is able to get along with deceit, makes their way through life by deceiving others, they don't have integrity, do they? They lack that truth in their heart, that truth in their life. They have maybe, avoided the actual sin, but they've not really pursued righteousness in their life, right? That's what he says. So he says, God, just put me in the balances. Allow me to be weighed out. Allow integrity to be what God knows about me, and allow other people to know that I'm someone with integrity too. Sometimes we think that we're getting away with it. We think that, I can get away with telling this lie. Nobody knows. Nobody can tell. I can do it, in a way that I'm shady enough. People don't know that what I'm doing. But you know what? You might get away with that for a while. But in the end, it's going to find you out. I think anybody who's been around the block long enough knows you never get away with deceit in the long run. You'll never get away with it. It's going to catch up to you. And so he asked God, he says, I'm cutting a covenant with my mouth that I don't lie, that I'm not going to be someone that's filled with deceit. Instead, I'm going to be filled with integrity. I want God to weigh me. I want him who knows my heart to know that I'm telling the truth. And he says in verses 7 and 8, he says, if my step hath turned out of the way, and mine heart hath walked after mine eyes, if any blot hath cleaved to mine hands, then let me sow and let another eat. Yea, let my offspring be rooted out. You see, he's cutting the covenant. He's saying, if this becomes what I'm about, he says, then let me plant things and let other people eat them. Let me not get a harvest from the plants that I'm sowing. The second part of it, let my offspring be uprooted. He's not talking about his children. He's talking about the plants that he's planting. He's talking about his harvest. He says, don't allow me to have fruitfulness from my labors. Don't allow me to enjoy. Let those crops be uprooted. That's what he's saying. I'm cutting a covenant with my mouth. He cuts a covenant with his eyes. Thirdly, he cuts a covenant with his spouse. Verses 9 through 12. Verses 9 through 12, he says, if mine heart hath been deceived by a woman, or if I have laid wait at my neighbor's door. Verse 9, he says, both things that happen with adultery, and that's this. My heart's been deceived, I've been lured into a wrong relationship, or I've laid wait at my neighbor's door. I've instigated the wrong relationship. He attacks both sides of how adultery happens. He says, I'm attacking both sides here. If I allow my covenant with my spouse to come second place, and I allow adultery to enter my life, he tells it right here in verse 10 and 11. Let my wife grind to another. Let the others bow down upon her, for this is a heinous crime. Yea, it is an iniquity to be punished by the judges. A heinous crime. Marriage is a sacred vow. Marriage is a sacred commitment. For most people that have gone through marriage, you realize that it's probably the most solemn vow that you take in life. It's that vow to, love and to honor and to cherish and to sickness and in health and all the rest. What's the point of that marriage vow? To say this is a solemn commitment. This is something that I'm not going to violate. But all too often we get our society, it means very little anymore. You go and you look in the city paper, well, I can get a divorce for $99. No fault divorce. Just throw that vow out the door. It doesn't matter anymore. We think of adultery just like, well, that happens. People do that, We look at our television shows that are out there, the programs, they just make this commonplace. We've become desensitized to the great heinous crime that Job calls adultery, an iniquity to be punished. Adultery should not be looked upon as commonplace or okay or just do what makes you happy. Adultery is something that destroys. It destroys our own lives. It destroys our marriages. And it's ultimately destroying our society. We have to have a covenant with our spouse. And he says in verse 12, it's a fire that consumeth to destruction and would root out all mine increase. He says it's going to take over your life. It's going to destroy you. It's going to remove you from all of the good that you've ever been given. It's not worth it. Make that covenant with your spouse. Cut it with your spouse. Maybe you need to renew that covenant that you've made. Then verses 13 to 15, we see the fourth point that he says. Verses 13 to 15, he says, I've made a covenant with my subordinates. He says, if I did despise the cause of my manservant or of my maidservant when they contended with me, what then shall I do when God riseth up? And when he visiteth, what shall I answer him? He begins with this. Of course, Job, as many people did, they had servants. Most of us probably don't come from households that have servants today. But there were servants in Job's days. You could ask whether they were slaves or servants, and I don't think the point really matters in this particular instance. But the point is, he says, if I did despise the cause of my manservant or maidservant when they contended with me. What shall I do then when God riseth up? He's saying, there's going to be times when I'm going to be at odds with the people who serve me, people who I am in authority over. There's people that are going to have different ideas than I do. There are going to be people that maybe don't do things the way I would have them done. And I'm going to have a contention with them. That's what he's saying here. When I have that contention, he says, and if I just say, hey, your opinion doesn't matter. You just do what you're told. You don't have any knowledge. You don't have any ability. You can't contribute to the decision making that I've been granted. You have no value in my eyes. You're a subordinate. You're somebody who's below me. I rule with an iron fist. He says, if I allowed that to be how I treat people who are in subordinate roles under me, he says, what shall I do when God riseth up? He says, what's that going to put me in when God comes before me? Where do we stand before God? Well, we don't. We don't stand much at all. We are all subordinates to an almighty and all-powerful and perfectly holy God. He says, what shall I do when God rises up? If I don't care one whit about people who are under me, people who serve me, what am I going to do when God comes to me? What am I going to expect from him? We shouldn't be lording over other people. You want to find out how someone's going to treat people? Go to the restaurant someday. See how he treats the waiter or the waitress. They treat him with respect. They treat him as human beings. Or do they say, this is it, you're not fast enough, you're this or that. When waiters and waitresses are servants in those roles. And we need to treat them with respect. How do we treat our kids? Kids that are under us. We're in their authority over them, right? Do we treat them like, you don't matter, you don't care, you're not valued, you're not important? No. God says we aren't to have that type of relationship with others. Anyone that we might be in authority over. Maybe we have employees. Maybe you have people that work for you. Maybe you have contractors that work for you. They're not any less human being than you are. When we all stand before God, do you know we stand as equals? It won't matter whether you were a plumber or a trash guy or a doctor or a lawyer. We won't matter. All those social norms go out the window. It won't matter whether you're a black or a white or an Asian or a Mexican or whatever. It won't matter what color your skin is. We're all going to stand before God as equals. It won't matter what type of education you had. It won't matter whether you attended church all your life. It won't matter. We'll stand before God one-on-one as subordinates under him. God wants us to value other people because we're all going to answer to him one day. And so he says in verse 15, he says, did not he that made me in the womb make him? And did not one fashion us in the womb? These people are to be valued because we all came the same way. We all, the old adage is, right? We all put our pants on one leg at a time. That's the fact. Nobody floats on air. We're not better than someone just because we've been given authority over them. And honestly, I think that's some of the big problems that we've had in traditional marriages over the years. Sometimes, men, not to just pick on you, you've forgotten the fact that your wife is your helpmeet. Yeah, you have a position of authority, but she's got an equal standing before God. You've been given her because there's things that you're missing in your life. If you didn't need a helpmeet, you wouldn't have a spouse. She's someone that you need, and you can't lord your authority over her. We need to see other people as valued and loved and equal and important because that's how God sees them. And we need to have a covenant. Job says, I'm going to put a covenant before myself. Cut a covenant that I'm going to make sure I treat people with respect and dignity and love. And know that ultimately we all stand before God one day. Verse 16, we see the last covenant that we're going to cover at least here this morning. He says, if I have withheld from the poor from their desire, or have caused the eyes of the widow to fail. Finally, Job says, I'm going to make a covenant with the needy. A covenant with the needy. He says, these are the things that are important for me to do. I'm going to make sure that I'm not going to withhold something from people who need what I have. If I have withheld, you see those words? It presumes that he has the wherewithal to meet the needs of someone else. Sometimes we don't have the wherewithal. But he says, if I have something that I could use to help someone else, and I've willingly chosen not to give that to them, he says, that's not right. That's not good. He says, I need to look at the cause that they have, the desires that they need, the poor, the needy, the widows, people who aren't able always to meet their own needs. You've ever thought about it this way, but you ever ask why God's given you what you have? Well, the American way says, well, it's so that I can get it in my 401k and, invest it in a stock market that's going to tank. No, that's not going to help you in the end. I heard a sermon years ago, and it's still true today. There aren't any trailer hitches on hearses. Ever think about that? You've never seen a hearse pulling a U-Haul. You're not going to take it with you. God's given it to you here, now, to use for His glory. Yeah, to meet your needs, to be a blessing to you, but also to be a blessing to others. Maybe there's things that you have and you say, boy, I'm not gonna let that out of my hand because that's too important to me. This is too valuable. I've got to keep this. Or you know what? I've told this story probably before, but years ago I had a friend who I was helping to move, and this was a long, long time ago. And it was a time when I still don't have very, very many good tools, but I have enough tools to get my job done, right? But at the time, I didn't have very many tools at all. And I was helping my friend. I took a toolbox with me, the few tools that I had along, and he needed a screwdriver. And I knew this guy was not reliable. I knew he was one of these, you kind of forgets things and kind of whifty, with things. And so he says, he was disassembling a bed or something. And he says, I need a screwdriver to disassemble a bed. And I knew this guy, he didn't have any tools. He didn't know what he was, I knew when I brought the toolbox it was going to be needed because he wouldn't know how to deal with this stuff. So I said, well, I've got a screwdriver out in my car. So I went out, helped him disassemble the bed. And I thought, when I gave him the screwdriver, I thought, I'm never going to see this screwdriver again. 30 years later, I haven't seen that screwdriver again. And I don't think he probably ever knew that he took it or kept it. But the fact is, I had a screwdriver. Of course, I've remembered it all these years. But it's a good illustration, right? It was the only decent screwdriver I had at the time, and I was like, here, I'm giving you my best screwdriver, and here, I never saw it again. And for a while, it ate at me a little bit, It was like I knew it was the right thing to do, but I also knew it wasn't what I wanted to do. Sometimes giving away what we have isn't always what we want to do, but we do it because we know it's the right thing to do. And we do it sometimes. We let people borrow something, and we say, I'm going to let somebody borrow it, and you know what? It's going to be no strings attached. I know you need it. I know that if it doesn't get broken or ruined or whatever, that you're probably going to give it back to me if you remember. But you know what? If you don't, it's in the Lord's hands. What does it really matter in the end? I've gone through lots of screwdrivers in the last 30 years. God's given me another one when I needed it. I don't know whether I borrowed it from somebody else or how I got the next one, but but the point is, sometimes you have someone that needs something and you say, well, I can't give you this. This is something you're afraid you'll break it. I'm afraid you'll ruin it. I'm afraid that, you won't give it back. I'll loan you this money. I'll never get paid back. You know what? You might not. Give with no strings attached. Give because God's given something to you, and maybe he's given that to you so that you can be a blessing to someone else. Make a covenant with the needy. That's the idea behind this. Verse 17, he says this, have I eaten my morsel myself alone, and the fatherless has not eaten thereof. You think about this? He says, have I ever sat at home with a nice big meal, and I've eaten my morsel, while there's somebody I know that, hey, I'm going to throw out more food than he's going to eat today? Do you know somebody like that? Maybe God's given you that so that he could invite him to your table. He says, if I have seen any perish, verse 19, for want of clothing, or any poor without covering. He says, have I seen people that you know, they're walking around in rags, and I think, you know what, I'm about their size. I got 3 of those in my closet. I could help you out. Have you ever thought that way? That should be our thinking as Christians, to show Christ's love in tangible ways. He says, verse 23, for the destruction from God was a terror to me, and by reason of his highness I could not endure. You know what does he say? He says, I'm not going to be stingy with others because God's not been stingy with me. If God treated you in the same way that you treated the needy, what state would you be in? Imagine that. If we got our blessings based on how we blessed others. That's not how it works. God blesses us, and then he says, go. Go share that with someone. We keep getting the blessing. How much do we share it? So Job says, I've cut a covenant before the needy. Cut a covenant with my eyes. Cut a covenant with my mouth that I won't lie and deceit. I've cut a covenant with my spouse that I won't violate those marriage vows. I've cut a covenant with people who are under me, under my authority, people who are my subordinates. I've cut a covenant with the needy. I've done these things not because I'm just trying to put away those things that are wrong, but because I really want to pursue what's right before me. So I'm just going to ask as we close this morning, what kind of covenant do you need to cut in your life? What maybe commitment or recommitment do you need to make to some of these things, or maybe some other things that God's asked in your life? Maybe it brought to your mind this morning. What areas have maybe you failed to live according to what God would have for you to pursue righteousness? A covenant with your eyes, a commitment to not look upon or dwell upon those people or things that will produce lust or covetousness in your life. Maybe a covenant with your mouth to maybe be slow to speak, to be sure that you're always forthright and honest and full of integrity in all of your dealings. Maybe you need to have the covenant with your spouse. Maybe renew that. To renew that commitment to your marriage vow, that you might truly love and honor and cherish your spouse the way God intended your life and your marriage to be. Maybe you need to make a covenant with your subordinates. Maybe you're known to be that guy with the iron fist. But maybe you need to begin to treat people with respect and equality, especially those who are under you. Maybe your children or your employees or even your waitress. Or maybe you need to be covenant with the needy. Cut that covenant with them to be more sensitive to the needs of others. To look for those ways and places that you can help someone who has less than you. And be willing to share with them not just what God's given you, but the truth of the salvation that's found in him. You know, all of these things, as Job talks about his righteousness, and as we talk about our pursuit of righteousness, do you know what one of our greatest tools for sharing Christ to others is? For people to see something in us that they want for themselves. And if they see us always under the dark cloud of, here's what you can't do, come join the Christian realm. Can't do this, you can't do that, you can't, well, why do I want to join that club? But if they see someone who truly loves people, who truly cares for people, who truly looks at people equally, who truly is a person of integrity, who really is doing all they can to pursue righteousness in their life, do you know what? You're not going to find that in the world. Why are you pursuing righteousness? Why do you care if you lie to somebody? To just, why do you care about those needy people? Why do you care about your marriage? Nobody else does. Well, I care about it because I have a God who loved me, a God who blessed me, and a God who sent his son to die for me. And you can know that too. That can be one of your greatest tools to share Christ with someone else when you begin to cut those covenants that you need to make in your life.